Welcome back to my channel, where real story takes its time. Let's get into it.
I'm Sean, 28, and if you'd asked me a few years ago whether I thought my family would ever actually surprise me in a good way, I probably would have laughed. Not long ago, I realized that the celebrations my family held were more about appearances than anyone actually caring about what I wanted. My parents, especially my dad, have this habit of treating everything like it's a performance, a way to show off their perfect family life. My younger brother, Kyle, has always been the golden favorite, the one whose mistakes were forgiven and whose successes were amplified like trophies on a shelf. Me? I was, well, I was the quiet one. The one who worked hard, stayed out of trouble, and still somehow got brushed aside in family decisions. Over the years, I got used to it, or at least I thought I did. It was a Saturday evening, the kind of evening that should have been casual but wasn't. My parents were celebrating their 35th anniversary, and as usual, the entire extended family had been roped into attending. The dining room was immaculately set, the silver polished, the flowers carefully arranged in a way that screamed more Instagram photo op than genuine celebration. I walked in, trying to ignore the tight knot forming in my stomach. Every time I saw this room, memories of being sidelined in my own home came flooding back. Kyle was already there, leaning back in a chair with that smug half-smile he wore when he thought he was about to be praised. He had no idea, of course, that the admiration he thrived on was carefully manufactured by my parents. Dinner started predictably. My mom fussed over everyone, subtly reminding them of how much she had sacrificed for us, while my dad held court in his usual way. Small talk that felt more like a lecture on how their children should behave, with occasional nods of approval toward Kyle. I played along, sipping my water, letting them think I was just another quiet participant in the grand spectacle. But inside, I was bracing myself. I had learned long ago that moments like these were never about me, so I'd started preparing my own little internal scripts to survive them. And then it happened. My dad cleared his throat, which immediately drew everyone's attention, as if a bell had been rung to announce the main event. "We've decided," he began, in that slow, deliberate way he uses when he wants people to hang on his every word, "to leave the house to Kyle. He'll know what to do with it." There was a pause, a nod from my mom, a few murmurs of approval from relatives, and all around me, eyes gleamed with what I could only describe as predatory excitement. I felt the familiar pang of invisibility settle in my chest. Of course, Kyle. Of course the house, the place I grew up in, the one I'd always taken care of in quiet ways, fixing the leaky faucets, shoveling snow, patching holes in the walls when no one noticed, was going to him. I smiled. A simple, calm smile, but it wasn't born of happiness. "That's sweet," I said, voice soft, steady. "I actually bought it from the bank last month." Silence fell. Not the polite kind, but the kind that makes people freeze mid-breath, like the room itself had suddenly realized it was in the wrong timeline. My dad blinked. My mom's hand hovered over her glass, trembling slightly. Kyle's face went pale, not the charming, polished pale, but the raw, stunned pale of someone realizing they had been outmaneuvered without even knowing a game was being played. And in that moment, I realized something fundamental about my family. They thrived on control, on the illusion that their decisions were final and unquestionable. They liked to feel superior, but they had never counted on me learning their patterns, watching the way they moved, listening to the undercurrents of who really got what and why. And while Kyle and the others sat in shock, my mind was already racing ahead, thinking about what this small victory, quiet as it seemed, meant for the next moves. I could feel the tension in the room coiling, thick and expectant. My parents' mouths moved, trying to recover. My dad opened his mouth, probably to argue, to assert dominance, to reclaim the narrative, but I didn't give him the chance. My calm exterior, the polite smile, the simple factual statement that nullified their grand announcement. It had created a fissure. I watched, silently, as the cracks began to show. And while everyone else seemed frozen in disbelief, I felt an unfamiliar thrill, not of cruelty, but of anticipation. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just a bystander in my family's story. I was part of the plot twist. Still, I didn't let myself gloat. I sat back, folded my hands on the table, and let them stew in the silence. The relatives shifted uncomfortably, looking between my parents and Kyle, trying to process what had just happened. Whispers began, but no one dared speak too loudly. And in that growing, thickening tension, I realized just how deeply this family had underestimated me all these years. My parents had assumed that I would accept my place, that I would smile politely and move on. But I wasn't smiling out of submission. I was smiling because I had already started winning in a way they couldn't even see coming. By the time dessert arrived, the atmosphere had completely shifted. My mom tried to engage me, asking about work, subtly probing for a hint of guilt, a crack in my composure. I answered calmly, fully aware that my words, measured and deliberate, were setting the tone. Kyle barely touched his dessert, glancing at me with something between confusion and simmering anger. I could see the gears turning in his head, trying to figure out what had just happened. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. Because the truth was, I wasn't just going to let a simple bank purchase be the end of it. My family had a long history of entitlement, of thinking that birthright alone gave someone power over everything. And now, for the first time, I had the leverage. Quiet, methodical, undeniable leverage. The kind that doesn't scream but builds, like a slow-burning fire. And the best part? They had no idea how much trouble they were about to be in. I took a sip of water, leaning back slightly, keeping my smile intact, letting the silence stretch. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was patient, watching, waiting, because every family has its weak points, and I had been studying mine for years. And as I glanced at Kyle, his smug expression finally slipping into something raw and unrefined, I felt the thrill of knowing that this dinner, this moment, was just the first move in a much larger game. A game they had been playing for decades, and one I was finally ready to win. The night should have ended with cake, small talk, and everyone going home with polite smiles plastered on their faces. But that kind of conclusion has never been in my family's vocabulary. After my little reveal, the tension in the dining room didn't dissipate. It thickened, settled like a fog over everything. My parents, of course, didn't know how to respond. My dad kept glancing at me, this faint crease forming between his brows that I hadn't seen since I was a kid and had first spoken up to correct one of his ridiculous, self-important lectures. My mom, always the more subtle manipulator, was silent, but her hands fidgeted with the napkin at her side, her eyes darting from Kyle to me, to the rest of the family, and back again. Kyle, though, was the most fascinating. He went through the stages of disbelief, anger, and, finally, outrage in a matter of minutes. He tried to mask it at first, smiling tightly, making polite, clipped comments as if everything was normal. "Well, I guess that's interesting," he said, forcing a chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He cleared his throat, probably hoping to redirect attention back to himself, to regain some control, to reassert the narrative that he was the favored one, the rightful heir to the house. But no one followed his cue. The room had shifted. Everyone was waiting for my parents to salvage the moment, to explain that it's just a joke, or you'll see, Sean doesn't really mean it. But the words never came. Instead, the entire night became a slow-burning war. My parents started their usual passive-aggressive barrage, tiny digs that masqueraded as concern. "Sean, are you sure you're managing the bank paperwork properly? It seems complicated," my dad said at one point, the words dripping with doubt. My mom chimed in, "I just hope you're not rushing into something so important without thinking of the family." Every comment was carefully calculated to make me second-guess myself, to make me feel guilty for daring to assert control over something they assumed was automatically Kyle's. But I didn't falter. I had anticipated this. I stayed calm, measured, answering politely, factually, without giving them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Meanwhile, Kyle's behavior started escalating in ways I hadn't quite expected. He moved from subtle digs to outright insults, still disguised as humor. "Well, I guess next time I'll just have to live in a hotel whenever I visit," he said, pretending to laugh. Can't really be comfortable knowing the place is technically yours now, can we? The room laughed politely, a few relatives awkwardly shifting in their seats, trying to diffuse the tension. But I saw through it. Kyle was panicking. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was the first time in years that he had felt like he could lose, like the control my parents had fostered around him wasn't absolute. My parents noticed his unease, and their usual defense mechanisms kicked in: blame, guilt, and subtle manipulation. "Sean, don't forget that family comes first," my mom said sweetly, leaning slightly forward, her voice almost sugary. "Maybe you should reconsider and let Kyle. He's younger, he needs guidance, and he's just so excited." I froze, realizing the scope of their expectation. Not only were they trying to guilt me, but they were openly favoring him in front of everyone again, treating my patience and intelligence like inconveniences to be corrected. I felt something twist in my chest, that familiar mix of frustration and sadness that comes from being consistently undervalued. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't silent. I was angry, yes, but calm in a way that made the simmering heat under my skin all the more dangerous. As dessert arrived, the emotional strain in the room became almost tangible. My parents' comments grew sharper, though still veiled as polite concern. Kyle, sensing weakness in their defense, escalated further. "I don't get it," he said, leaning forward slightly, his voice dripping with feigned innocence. "I mean, Sean, you've never really cared about the house anyway, right? Always busy with work, always disappearing. Seems like you just want to make things difficult for everyone." I wanted to laugh. He thought he had read me, thought he understood me, but he had no idea how carefully I had planned each move, how methodical I was in waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Then it happened. The breaking point. A relative, one of my aunts, tried to mediate, suggesting that maybe I should just let Kyle have the house to avoid family tension. I stayed quiet, letting the words settle. My parents' eyes darted to me, and that's when the full realization struck me. They weren't going to support me. They weren't going to see reason. Their entire family structure was built around control and favoritism. And even with me holding proof, even with me literally having purchased the house, they still expected me to fold. Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in clarity. I realized that everything I had endured, all the dismissals, all the favoritism toward Kyle, all the subtle and overt ways I had been made to feel less than, was about to culminate in this one moment. And I wouldn't let it happen. Not silently, not politely. I straightened in my chair, making sure my posture radiated calm authority. "I understand everyone's perspective," I said, my voice quiet but deliberate, each word weighed like a stone. "I know Kyle has always been preferred, but the house is mine. I bought it from the bank. It's legally mine, and it's fully under my name. Nothing in the law or in my efforts changes that fact. I'm not asking for permission because it's not a request." The room went still again, heavier this time. I could see the flicker of panic cross my dad's face, the way my mom's hands tightened into fists under the table, and Kyle's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, unable to form words that made sense. And then the betrayal happened. My parents, the very people who had always claimed to prioritize fairness and family, chose their favorite over the truth. My dad leaned back, shook his head, and said, "Sean, we know you bought it, but you don't understand the family dynamic. Kyle needs this more than you do. You're just being selfish." My mom nodded, her face the picture of sweet resignation. "It's not about legality, Sean. It's about what's best for the family, and Kyle deserves this. You should see how generous we are being by letting you have your own life while he takes over the house." I froze. The words hit like a hammer. I had expected resistance, subtle digs, perhaps even passive-aggressive lectures, but I had not expected open dismissal of reality itself, an outright choice to prioritize their golden child over the evidence in front of them. My hands clenched under the table. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fury, betrayal, and disbelief. Everything I had thought I could count on, my parents' basic sense of fairness, was gone. And just like that, I realized that this wasn't just about a house. This was about years of being undermined, dismissed, and sidelined in every family decision. Kyle, sensing victory, finally smiled, smug and triumphant. "Thanks, Dad. Thanks, Mom. I knew you'd do the right thing," he said, voice smug, practically preening as he soaked in the approval. The room, which had been tense, erupted in murmurs of agreement, with a few relatives nodding like this was just another day in the family saga. I felt something in me shift, a cold, calculating clarity. This wasn't a moment for confrontation yet, not in front of the family, but it was the moment I knew I needed a plan, a real one. For the first time in years, I understood something vital. In this family, logic and effort meant nothing. Only appearances, favoritism, and perceived control mattered. And if I wanted what was mine, not just the house, but respect, recognition, and the sense of fairness I had been denied, I would have to play their game. Only I would play it on my terms. I didn't speak after that, letting the room chatter around me, letting Kyle bask in his temporary triumph. But inside, a storm was brewing. I began calculating, silently, meticulously, thinking of every possible leverage point, every past slight, every instance where they had underestimated me. By the time the evening ended, my parents were smiling politely at relatives, patting Kyle on the back, congratulating him for getting what he deserved. I followed along outwardly, nodding, smiling in that calm, controlled way that hid the fire inside me. But as soon as the car door clicked shut behind me later that night, the mask fell. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the dark streets ahead, and I allowed myself a quiet moment of real anger. Not the petty frustration I had felt over the years, but sharp, precise, burning anger. I had been betrayed by the people who should have had my back, and now I knew, without question, that the game had changed. I wouldn't ask for fairness anymore. I wouldn't hope for acknowledgement. I would take it. All of it. After that night, I didn't speak to my parents or Kyle for nearly a week. Not because I was angry, though I certainly was, but because I needed space, clarity, and, most importantly, a plan. The betrayal at dinner had hit me harder than I expected, and the silence from everyone else in the room made it sting even more. It was as if the world itself had conspired to remind me of my place, a place I had never accepted, but one they assumed I would eventually fall into. For days, I wandered around my small apartment, staring at the walls, thinking about every slight, every dismissal, every moment when they had looked at me as if my efforts were invisible. I could almost hear their voices, the familiar cadence of entitlement dripping from every word they had said that night. "Sean, you're being selfish. Kyle deserves this more than you. It's for the good of the family." They thought those words were final. They thought I'd crumble. I won't lie, I considered it. I considered giving up entirely, pretending the house, the family, and the whole mess didn't matter. I considered just leaving, letting Kyle have his victory, and pretending I was fine. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that giving up wasn't just surrendering the house. It was surrendering myself. It was letting years of effort, intelligence, and careful planning mean nothing. And I wasn't about to do that. Not anymore. That night, sitting alone on the edge of my couch, staring at the dim glow of my laptop screen, I made a decision. I would rise, not with noise, not with tantrums or accusations, but quietly, deliberately, in a way that would leave them stunned when the payoff came. The first step was to reclaim my sense of self-worth. For too long, I had measured myself by their approval, letting their favoritism dictate how I saw myself. But the house, it was mine. I had bought it. That fact alone reminded me that I was capable, resourceful, and, yes, more competent than they had ever given me credit for. I started small. I organized my finances meticulously, making sure every document, every payment, and every legal detail was airtight. I revisited old accounts, investments, and projects I had started over the years and quietly assessed their potential. Everything I had ever done, every extra hour at work, every effort I had made to be independent, became fuel for a strategy that I wasn't fully ready to reveal yet. Meanwhile, I began rebuilding emotionally. I started journaling, pouring all the resentment, the frustration, and the anger onto paper. It was therapeutic, yes, but more importantly, it gave me a record of every slight, every injustice, every dismissive word ever thrown my way. It was a map of weakness in my family's armor, and I intended to use it. Every memory of unfairness became a lesson, every pang of resentment a reminder of what I deserved. I didn't need their approval to succeed. I only needed their underestimation. Work became my second pillar. I threw myself into it, not for their sake, not to prove anything directly to them, but because competence builds leverage. I started taking on projects I knew would give me long-term advantage, quietly networking, and making connections that my family would never notice or understand. Kyle, as usual, thought everything was easy for him, that he was inherently entitled to success. But while he wasted time basking in approval, I was building a foundation that couldn't be shaken by words, whims, or favoritism. The house, though, lingered in my mind constantly. Every time I drove past it, every time I walked near it, every time I thought about the years I had spent maintaining it quietly while my family ignored my effort, a fire ignited in me. And that fire wasn't about revenge yet. It was about reclaiming what was mine, about asserting myself in a world where my parents and Kyle had always assumed I would remain a background character. Slowly, meticulously, I began to plan small moves. Every visit to the house, every maintenance task, every interaction with contractors or bank officials became a way to quietly assert my authority, to solidify my claim without creating drama. I didn't need to shout. It wasn't the time for spectacle. I needed patience, strategy, and precision. Of course, rebuilding in the shadows wasn't without its emotional toll. There were nights when doubt crept in, whispering that perhaps my parents were right, that maybe I was overreacting, or that Kyle's smug sense of victory meant something more than it did. But I reminded myself that my measure wasn't their perception. It was my action, my results, and my consistency. I also started reaching out to a few trusted friends, people outside the family, who could offer perspective and guidance without judgment. Their support, though subtle, became essential. They reminded me that I wasn't powerless, that intelligence, patience, and diligence were often more potent than loud confrontation. It wasn't long before the first tangible signs of my rise began to appear. I managed to secure a few lucrative side projects, investments that my family had scoffed at when I mentioned them in passing. I refinanced certain aspects of the house, increased its value quietly, making the property more secure, more untouchable, and more strategically advantageous. Each small success was a quiet triumph, and while Kyle and my parents remained blissfully unaware, I could feel my confidence growing. I was no longer the overlooked son. They were the oblivious ones, and I was learning just how powerful that position could be. But the rise wasn't purely financial. It was personal, emotional, and psychological. I began to develop boundaries I had never asserted before, politely declining family suggestions that felt like criticism or manipulation, subtly reclaiming my voice in conversations that had always been dominated by their authority. At first, the pushback was minimal. My parents were still smarting from my initial reveal at dinner and didn't want to escalate, and Kyle was too busy wallowing in his perceived triumph. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they noticed the shift, before they realized that the quiet, calm Sean they had always underestimated was no longer intimidated, no longer compliant. And then came the first major challenge to my newfound stability, the subtle undermining that my parents couldn't resist. They tried to throw subtle obstacles my way, hints that I was overreaching with the house, veiled warnings about responsibilities I hadn't considered, and the classic guilt-laden reminder that family always comes first. I smiled politely, nodded, and moved forward with my plans. Every time they tried to push, I countered quietly and effectively, using facts, paperwork, and logic in ways they couldn't argue against. Every small victory, every calm rebuttal, added to the building tension. The game was heating up, and I was finally learning to play it like a master. Kyle, of course, began to notice. He would drop by, claiming casual visits, watching, questioning, pretending interest in trivial details, all in an effort to assert his dominance. But the thing about underestimation is that it's incredibly potent. While he assumed he was in control, I was already 5 moves ahead, using his pride and overconfidence against him. I allowed him to win small points, letting him believe he was clever and observant, while I quietly tightened my grip on the larger picture. Every time he tried to boast or belittle, I let it slide, recording every slight, noting every mistake, and waiting for the precise moment when it would all culminate. Emotionally, this period was transformative. I began to see my parents not as authority figures, but as flawed individuals, predictable, entitled, and utterly blind to my capabilities. I no longer sought their validation. I sought only results. And slowly, methodically, I began to reclaim not just the house, but myself, my confidence, my independence, and my sense of worth that had been quietly eroded over decades. By the time the first winter storms rolled around, I was ready for the next phase. Not yet the confrontation, not yet the full reveal, but the moment where I would begin testing their reactions, measuring their arrogance, and finding exactly where the cracks in their carefully constructed world lay. I wasn't impatient, though. This was a slow burn, a calculated escalation. My family had underestimated me for years, and that underestimation would be their undoing. Sitting in my apartment one cold evening, the house secure in my name, Kyle blissfully unaware of the shifts taking place, and my parents still wrapped in their illusion of control, I felt a rare combination of calm and exhilaration. I had hit rock bottom emotionally during that first betrayal, but now, quietly, meticulously, I was rising. Not just to claim the house, but to reclaim my life, my dignity, and the recognition I had been denied for decades. And deep down, I knew the real fun was just beginning. Because the higher I climbed, the more their entitlement would blind them to the inevitable collapse waiting just around the corner. And when that moment came, I would be ready, not angry, not impulsive, but precise, deliberate, and unstoppable. The week after I decided it was time to stop reacting and start orchestrating, everything shifted into a different register. Revenge, I'd learned in those late nights of planning and journaling, wasn't a single loud act. It was a choreography. It required timing, allies, and the patience to wait until every piece was in place. I told myself, often, quietly, like a mantra, that I wasn't doing this to hurt for the sake of hurting. I was doing it to rectify a pattern that had erased me for years. I wanted them to see what it meant to be underestimated, and more importantly, to feel the consequences of their choices. With that in mind, I began the setup. First, I consolidated what I already had: paperwork, refinancing documents, receipts, emails with contractors, and bank statements. If there was anything my parents loved less than fairness, it was facts. Facts were stubborn, immovable. They didn't bend under charm or family mythology. I organized everything into a neat stack, labeled folders on my laptop, and created a backup, both physical and cloud-based, so nothing could be suddenly lost or dismissed as a misunderstanding. I contacted the lawyer I'd used for the purchase and scheduled a follow-up meeting to make sure the chain of title, liens, and insurance were all rock solid. I wanted to be untouchable on paper, but legal solidity alone felt hollow without strategy. My family was emotional. They thrived on optics and gossip. I needed narratives, too, subtle ones that could be directed at the right people at the right time. For that, I began collecting stories, but not just mine. I started asking questions in casual, almost innocent tones to relatives who had drifted close to my parents over the years. I asked about past decisions, about money moved through family loans, about an old contractor who'd once done half-finished work on the house and disappeared. I wasn't accusatory. I listened. People talk when they feel comfortable, especially about things they think are private but aren't really. I made mental notes, wrote them down, and waited for patterns to reveal themselves. The next, and perhaps most crucial step, was allies. For years, my social circle had been my refuge, the place I could be recognized without filters. I reached out to 3 people carefully. My childhood friend Maria, who'd always been level-headed and had a way of cutting through family drama with humor. Jamal, a colleague from work who knew a surprising amount about property management and had a dry appreciation for strategic plans, and Lena, a paralegal I met at a neighborhood meeting who owed me a favor after I helped her with a small home repair. I didn't pitch a grand plan to any of them. I never did. I asked small, specific things that all fit into a larger pattern. Maria agreed to be present at family events more often, but as a neutral friend who could later testify about certain conversations. Jamal helped me audit the property's maintenance history and provided a clear list of needed repairs that could be leveraged into cost arguments. Lena reviewed some documents pro bono and helped me phrase questions that would sound casual but would prod for useful admissions. There's an art to recruiting allies. You never make them co-conspirators in a way that risks them, but you do let them feel helpful, almost like they're doing you small favors. People like to be useful, and giving them a role kept everything lighter and less suspicious. It also kept me from feeling isolated in the quiet weeks when I was doing the real heavy lifting. Part of the setup was also reputational. For years, my parents had painted me as distant, aloof, and indifferent, traits that, conveniently for them, made it easy to ignore anything I did. I needed to reverse that narrative, not with arguments, but with visible evidence of competence. I began volunteering at a local community center, teaching a weekend class on basic home upkeep, simple things like fixing a leaky faucet, patching drywall, or reading an energy bill. It was earnest work, I liked it, and more importantly, it placed me in the public eye in a way that made casual chatter about what I did more credible. When relatives heard of neighbors praising that quiet son who fixed the community hall roof, it planted small seeds that would later make them hesitate before dismissing me outright. Financial maneuvering was another subtle battlefield. I refinanced a small portion of the house to free up liquidity, not to blow on obvious luxuries, but to have the ability to make improvements that would be publicly visible and indisputable. I replaced damaged gutters, had the roof inspected and repaired, and rehung the porch light that had always flickered on and off. These were not grand gestures, but they mattered. The house's curb appeal improved in a way that even the most distracted relative could remark on. On a practical level, these improvements also made it harder for anyone to claim the house was neglected or to use maintenance as a wedge to question my stewardship. There was, of course, the human element, Kyle. He was the most volatile piece on the board and the one I had to move carefully. He still visited more often than he admitted, lingering in the shadow of the house, pretending to drop by to check things, while really sniffing for a chance to prove me wrong. I learned his rhythms, when he was proud, how he reacted to praise, how fragile his ego was beneath the polished bravado. His arrogance would be a weapon I could use if I baited it just right. So rather than directly engage him, I fed his ego in small doses. I complimented him privately on things he did well, making him feel seen. And then, later, I would contrast that with public evidence of his incompetence. Letting him feel untouchable would make the eventual reveal that much more devastating. I also started carefully planting rumors the way you plant seeds, softly and in the right soil. To one cousin who liked to gossip, I mentioned, casually and with fake worry, that there were a few strange bookkeeping items from years ago, small sums moved between accounts that didn't add up. To another relative who worried about appearances, I hinted that there had been talk of financial help my parents gave to certain members of the family that never got properly documented. These were not accusations. They were suggestive questions that led others to revisit old conversations. The goal wasn't to create slander, but to create curiosity. People's imaginations tend to turn ambiguity into stories that fit their biases. If I could plant doubt, their own assumptions and resentments would do the rest of the work for me. There were personal risks, of course. I kept revisiting the moral boundary lines in my head. At night, sometimes, I would catch myself wondering if I was becoming the kind of person I had long despised, calculated, manipulative, patient at the expense of kindness. Those doubts were not idle. I wrote them down, examined them, and used them as a moral compass to prevent cruelty. My aim was not humiliation for humiliation's sake. It was exposure of choice. If they chose favoritism over fairness, those choices should have consequences that felt real. The more I thought about it, the more I justified the plan as an exercise in accountability rather than vindictiveness. A turning point in the setup came unexpectedly, and it arrived in the form of paperwork. While doing routine checks at the municipal records office, one of those quiet errands I had no reason to broadcast, I found an old permit for a structural adjustment to the house, signed off years ago by a contractor I recognized. The paperwork showed payments that didn't match the work completed. It was the kind of bureaucratic discrepancy that, in isolation, meant little. But combined with the receipts my aunt had offhandedly mentioned at dinner and the half-finished deck Jamal had photographed, it became a pattern. There were small financial oddities around the house that suggested either sloppy bookkeeping, opportunistic contracting, or something more deliberate. I picked up copies of everything, feeling the thrill of discovery that comes from connecting dots other people were too busy to see. Armed with these documents, I adjusted my approach. Instead of relying solely on optics and social manipulation, I could now craft a legal and financial narrative that supported the story I wanted to tell. If my parents tried to spin things as family matters immune to legal scrutiny, I would have facts that spoke in a language they respected, numbers and signatures, and municipal stamps. It was satisfying in a way that the improvisational cruelty at family dinners never was. This was precise, measurable, and defensible. Everything continued quietly for weeks. I scheduled the repairs in phases so neighbors would notice a steady improvement rather than a sudden overhaul. I invited Maria to come by for a casual tea the next time family gathered, making sure she would be within earshot during certain conversations. I let Jamal observe my interactions with contractors so he could later corroborate the sequence of events if needed. I even tolerated small provocations from Kyle, his smirks, his thinly veiled criticisms, because every reaction he gave could be cataloged and used at the right time. Probably the most satisfying part of the setup was watching my parents slip back into old habits while thinking they were still in control. My dad called me occasionally, his tone a little too fatherly, trying out a new cadence of reconciliation that was really just a test to see if I had softened. My mom sent recipes and a congratulatory text about the effort to keep the family home nice. I answered with civility without apology. Every polite refusal I made, every boundary I established, nudged them into believing their authority still had purchase. The irony was delicious. They assumed the playing field was unchanged even as I rearranged the chess pieces. And then, as the final phase of the setup began to click into place, something shifted externally, an invitation that looked, on the surface, harmless. My parents announced a small, intimate family brunch at the house to celebrate the recent improvements and invited close relatives. It was the perfect opportunity. Familiar people, a place whose optics I had already adjusted, and the presence of enough witnesses to make any sudden gaslighting awkward. I could have insisted on skipping it, but I didn't. This was too good to miss. If I wanted to demonstrate competence, legitimacy, and the quiet power of preparation, I needed an audience that mattered. The morning of the brunch, I woke early and walked through the house with a checklist: repairs verified, files accessible, allies in place, narrative seated. Maria arrived early by accident, claiming she wanted to help set the table. Jamal dropped by with innocuous questions about roof maintenance and stayed long enough to be seen talking to neighbors who had previously admired the improvements. Lena, improbably, popped in to offer a legal way to handle a parking nuisance, something trivial she could mention later to prove I'd been proactive. These small theatrical touches were all part of the layering. The house smelled faintly of lemon and fresh coffee. Sunlight hit the porch just so. Everything was staged to look natural. I stood in the kitchen while people filtered in, listening to the gentle hum of relatives catching up. Kyle arrived last, with that practiced, casual swagger, and his smile looked at once relieved and predatory. He had no idea how thoroughly his world was about to be tested. As people took their seats and my parents began to beam in that performative way they reserve for family gatherings, I felt a calm I hadn't known for years. This wasn't about theatrics. It was about timing. I had spent months assembling facts, allies, repairs, and narratives. I had recorded small humiliations and cataloged slights in a journal that now read less like therapy and more like a dossier. I had the legal proof, the witnesses, and the optics. All that remained was the exact sequence: when to reveal what, how much to let them defend themselves, and where to apply pressure so their own choices would seal the outcome. The thrill of it all, of finally being the author of my story, was tempered by a tiny, careful restraint. I wanted them to make the moves that would expose them. I wanted them to prove, in their own words and actions, that favoritism, not fairness, guided their decisions. The brunch chatter swelled, forks clinked, and my dad stood up to make a small toast about family, tradition, and the house staying in good hands. He talked about legacy in that sentimental way that assumed loyalty would follow. As he spoke, I felt 100 small decisions ripple in my chest: the calls I'd made, the hours I'd worked, the nights I'd spent thinking through contingencies. I reached into my pocket and felt the little folder I always carried now, the one with copies of everything I might need to present if this moment demanded it. My parents smiled at Kyle, expecting concord. Kyle smiled back, confident, untouchable, but he didn't know what else the day held. He didn't know about the municipal permit I'd photocopied, the neighbor who'd seen a contractor remove a bag of cash from a truck years ago, or the aunt who'd confessed under my gentle prompting that she'd been given money but never invoiced it. He didn't know that a few murmurs in the right corners could turn admiration into suspicion faster than any lecture could repair. Most of all, he didn't know that for the first time I'd stopped defining myself by their approval and instead used my effort and competence to create leverage they couldn't ignore. I raised my glass when the right beat came in the toast and felt the room's attention settle on me for a beat that felt longer than it should. The setup was complete. The allies were in place. The documents were at hand. The narrative seeds had been sown. The house gleamed with discreet care. The family's assumptions about me were intact, too intact, in fact. It was precisely those assumptions that would make the fall swift. Then, as the laughter rose and the coffee settled into comfortable conversation, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A single message, brief and practical, from Lena. "We're ready if you need to escalate. Call me." I read it once. Then again, the legal finality of those 3 words landing like a gavel. I slid the phone back into my pocket and let the smile on my face remain neutral. The next moves would be surgical, precise, and unavoidable. I could feel the moment approaching, the point where all the patient work would begin to pay off in ways that would force choices and reveal truths. And then my dad laughed, a bit too loudly, recounting an anecdote about Kyle as a child, how he'd once insisted on keeping a broken toy because it meant something. The room chuckled, my parents' eyes softened with pride, and Kyle's throat bobbed with self-satisfaction. For a second, it almost looked like nothing would happen at all. For a second, I could have sat back and let the sunlight warm my face, relishing a private victory. But the plan demanded action. The setup had done its job. Now the execution would require patience and a precise trigger. I took a slow sip of coffee, felt the porcelain under my fingers, and waited for the exact beat where everything I had put together would begin to move. The air felt charged, like the instant before a storm breaks. I was ready to strike, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with the tidy, undeniable weight of fact and careful timing. And then, right as my dad finished his story and the room relaxed, Kevin, my cousin who'd been quietly playing with his napkin near the window, suddenly said, almost to himself, "Do you remember when the contractor left early that summer? I always wondered where the rest of the money went." Heads turned. The room shifted. My pulse quickened. That offhand remark, seeded months ago, landed like a pebble in still water. Ripples broke outward, and in the hush that followed, I knew I had the opening I'd been waiting for. The moment Kevin made that seemingly casual remark about the missing money, the room went still. It was almost imperceptible at first, just a subtle shift in posture, a tilt of the head, but I saw it in real time. My parents' eyes, wide for a fraction of a second, their carefully maintained composure flickering. Kyle, oblivious to the undercurrent, tried to smile, his mind still in his own bubble of entitlement, but his hands betrayed him, twisting nervously in his lap. I knew I had the leverage I needed. The pebble had hit the perfect spot, and the ripples were about to cascade. I set down my coffee slowly, as if I were savoring the moment, and said softly, "Actually, Kevin, that's a great memory. Do you mind if I look into it? I've been reviewing some past permits and payments for the house, making sure everything's accounted for before we celebrate the improvements fully." My voice was calm, measured, deliberate, and it carried an authority that demanded attention. Everyone's heads turned toward me, suddenly aware that this wasn't going to be a casual brunch conversation anymore. Kyle frowned, trying to mask his unease with a cough. Sure, I guess. But it's probably nothing," he said, his tone defensive but unconvincing. He didn't realize that the documents I had meticulously gathered were already ready to back up every implication, every subtle seed I had planted over the past months. I had photos, receipts, municipal permits, bank statements, and even eyewitness notes from Maria, Jamal, and Lena. Everything I could possibly need to make the invisible visible, to turn suspicion into undeniable proof, was in my hands. I smiled faintly, exuding calm confidence. Nothing, maybe, but sometimes the small discrepancies explain larger patterns. I opened my laptop and set it on the kitchen counter, turning the screen toward my parents without saying another word. The first slide was simple, a spreadsheet with the contractor's name, the work promised, the payments made, and the missing or incomplete items. Next were photos showing half-finished projects, mismatched repairs, and evidence of funds withdrawn but unaccounted for. Each file was precise, factual, and easy to follow. I kept my voice even, quiet, letting the evidence do the work. My dad's face tightened. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. Kyle's jaw dropped, and for the first time in years, I saw him genuinely uncertain, unsure of how to assert dominance in a situation that didn't bend to his will. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to threaten. I simply clicked through the documents, showing ledger discrepancies, receipts that didn't match invoices, and email confirmations from years prior that contradicted my parents' story. I watched them try to parse each piece of evidence, their mouths opening and closing without forming coherent defenses. "Sean," my mother began, her voice trembling slightly. Well, maybe there's been some misunderstanding. We never." I cut her off gently but firmly. "Mom, Dad, I'm not accusing anyone of intent. I'm presenting facts. These are your choices and your records. Whether or not they were intentional, they're discrepancies that can't be ignored." My calm tone contrasted sharply with the tension in the room. I wasn't angry. I was precise, deliberate, unflinching. My parents' defenses weakened further under the weight of the evidence, their usual tools of manipulation, blame, charm, guilt, rendered useless. Kyle's voice, sharp with disbelief, broke the silence. This is your doing, isn't it?" His eyes flicked to me, frantic, confused. "You've been planning this for months?" I let a faint smile cross my lips. "Not planning," I said. "Preparing." I didn't need to manipulate reality. I simply followed it. The facts were always on my side. I just had to make sure they were visible. The room shifted again. Some relatives murmured, looking between my parents and me, sensing the gravity of the situation. They had witnessed the subtle rise I'd orchestrated over the past months without noticing it. Now it was undeniable. The calm, meticulous son they had dismissed had systematically dismantled the narrative they had built to favor Kyle. My dad tried to regain control. "Sean, this is unnecessary. The house, Kyle, he's still." "I don't need permission," I interrupted gently. "The house is mine. I purchased it legally. I maintain it. And I've taken every precaution to ensure it is secure and properly managed. The facts, the records, the improvements, they all demonstrate responsibility. I don't need anyone's blessing to claim what I've earned." I could see the color drain from their faces. My mother's hands clenched in her lap. Her voice caught somewhere between protest and panic. Kyle's usual smugness faltered completely. His eyes darted to my documents, then to my calm demeanor, then back again. He had always assumed that my lack of visible assertion meant weakness. Now he realized he had been entirely wrong. I paused, letting the weight of the silence settle. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. And in that clarity, the shift was complete. My family could see, finally, that their assumptions, their favoritism, and their dismissals had consequences. Every slight they had committed, every assumption they had made about my compliance, came to light not through shouting, but through the quiet power of preparation and fact. And then, as if to punctuate the moment, I turned to Kevin, my cousin, who had unknowingly delivered the perfect opening, and nodded slightly. Kevin mentioned a few minor details he remembered about payments and the contractor. The room followed the breadcrumbs, connecting the narrative themselves. My parents could no longer speak their way out. Kyle tried one last time, pointing fingers, attempting to redirect blame, but I ignored him, continuing to present the evidence calmly, allowing the room to reach its own conclusions. By the time I had finished, there was no room for denial. My parents' faces were pale, their postures slumped. Kyle sat frozen, still clinging to fragments of entitlement. But the room, the relatives, the witnesses, the neighbors who had quietly come to see the improvements, knew exactly what had happened. They could see competence, foresight, and preparation winning over assumption, favoritism, and arrogance. My parents had lost their narrative. Kyle had lost his presumed dominance, and I had reclaimed every ounce of respect that had been withheld from me for years. I closed the laptop gently, as if marking the conclusion of an unremarkable task. I'll be continuing the improvements and maintenance myself, I said, voice calm. I'm happy to answer questions or provide updates, but the house is under my care now. That's final. My parents tried to protest, tried to argue, but the room collectively resisted interruption. There was no audience left to side with them. Their power had evaporated, leaving them exposed. Kyle finally stood, muttering something about leaving, but even his exit was powerless. The damage was done, and everyone in the room understood it. I didn't follow him. There was no need. The point had been made. The house, the documentation, the subtle power plays, they had all converged perfectly. My parents' favoritism, their assumptions, and their dismissive treatment of me over the years had all led to this singular moment. They had underestimated me, and it had cost them control, credibility, and respect. After everyone left, I walked through the house alone, the quiet echo of footsteps on polished floors reminding me how far I had come. The improvements gleamed in the sunlight. The documents were tucked safely away, a tangible reminder of patience, intelligence, and strategic action. I thought back to that first dinner when my dad announced that Kyle would inherit the house, the room nodding in agreement, and I allowed myself a private smile. I hadn't just won a house. I had won acknowledgement, a subtle but absolute victory over years of manipulation, favoritism, and dismissal. And as I stood there, looking out over the yard I now fully controlled, I realized something deeper than satisfaction. This wasn't just about a building. It was about reclaiming agency, self-worth, and the quiet authority I had been denied for decades. The house was mine, the evidence was undeniable, and the lessons had been learned in full. The final quiet came as I closed the door behind me, walking down the path toward my car, knowing that everything my parents and Kyle had assumed about me had been overturned. Not with anger, not with drama, but with intelligence, patience, and undeniable truth. I smiled, the kind of smile that comes from absolute certainty. For the first time in years, I felt entirely, irrevocably in control. And in that silence, the only thought that mattered was simple, sharp, and final. Sometimes, the quietest actions echo the loudest. I'm Luke, 24, and if there's one thing I've learned growing up in my family, it's that birthdays are basically optional, unless they belong to my younger brother, Ryan. Today was supposed to be my 24th birthday, and I'd been feeling a little optimistic. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe my parents would remember I exist as more than the kid who doesn't quite measure up. Spoiler alert, I was wrong. The first sign came early in the morning, right when I had my hopes up the most. I rolled out of bed, excited to see the little decorations I'd asked Mom to put up, balloons, a tiny Happy Birthday Luke banner. But when I walked into the kitchen, the place looked normal. No streamers, no cake, no hints of the day being about me. Instead, I found a neatly wrapped gift sitting on the counter, not for me, but for Ryan. "Morning, champ," Dad said, glancing at me as he poured his coffee. "Ryan's got a big day today. Promotion at the firm. We're going to celebrate later. He actually earned it." I blinked. I, I have a birthday today." Dad's smile didn't falter. "Right, sure. But your brother's promotion is kind of a big deal, don't you think?" My stomach sank. It was the same pattern every year. My milestones quietly ignored while Ryan's accomplishments got the red carpet treatment. I tried to let it slide when I was younger, chalked it up to mom and dad being proud, but by now, at 24, it stung differently. It felt deliberate, personal, as if my successes didn't exist. Mom appeared from the living room, clutching her phone like it held the secrets of the universe. "We can have a little cake later for you," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. "Maybe after Ryan's guests leave." "Don't worry, honey. After Ryan's guests leave." I repeated it in my head like a mantra. My birthday, after my brother's celebration. My parents had built a wall around my special day, one I wasn't even allowed to step into until everything else had been celebrated. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just neglect. This was a statement. I wasn't as important as Ryan. I wasn't as deserving. I went back to my room, trying to ignore the simmering heat in my chest. Normally, I'd scroll through social media to distract myself, but my feed was full of congratulatory posts for Ryan. "Proud of my brother for the promotion. Hashtag family goals. And Ryan's hard work paid off." The messages didn't just remind me of his achievement. They reminded me of the contrast between his world and mine, a world where I had to fight to even be noticed. I flopped onto my bed and stared at the ceiling, feeling a mix of anger and something heavier, something I didn't want to name yet. The resentment was familiar. It had been simmering since high school when I realized no matter what I did, Ryan's successes would always outshine mine in my family's eyes. I remembered my high school graduation, when my GPA and awards barely earned a polite nod, while Ryan's football trophy got its own showcase in the living room. I'd convinced myself I didn't care, but today's scene in the kitchen reminded me that nothing had changed. Around noon, the first guests started arriving for Ryan's party. I watched from my window as my parents greeted his colleagues and friends, laughing, joking, serving hors d'oeuvres I hadn't even been offered. One of Ryan's friends came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "Hey Luke, happy birthday. We'll celebrate later, right?" The attempt at kindness stung. Later. The word echoed in my head. Later. For now, my family's attention was on Ryan. And not in a casual, happy for you way. In a way that made me feel invisible. I tried to keep myself busy. I opened my laptop and started organizing a small project I'd been working on. A creative venture I'd poured months into. Something I'd hoped would make me proud of myself. As I typed, I glanced toward the dining room, where Ryan was opening his gifts. He was grinning like the world had finally aligned itself perfectly for him, the way he always did, and my parents were hovering over him like bees guarding honey. Mom fussed over every detail, Dad laughed at every joke, and I was there, technically a member of the audience, officially allowed in the room, but practically erased from it. I felt the heat of frustration build, a mix of helplessness and something sharper, more calculated. This wasn't new, but today, the contrast hit differently. Today, it hurt in a way that made my chest tighten and my mind race. I realized I had two options. Sit here, stewing in my resentment, waiting for a maybe later slice of cake that would feel like a consolation prize, or do something about it. Something meaningful. Something that wouldn't just prove a point, but actually put me on the level playing field I'd never been given. As I stared at my laptop, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, a thought formed, subtle, almost frightening in its clarity. I had the power to do something. Something irreversible. Something that would demand my family acknowledge me, whether they liked it or not. And as I clicked through to my project, I felt a tiny smile creep across my face. Maybe this birthday wouldn't be celebrated with balloons or cake, but it could still be the start of my own celebration, the one where I finally reclaimed what they'd always denied me. Ryan's laughter drifted through the walls, light and carefree, while I sat there, chest tight with anticipation. My heart was pounding, a mix of nerves and excitement. Because for the first time, I wasn't thinking about waiting for their approval. I was thinking about taking control. I wasn't sure exactly how it would play out yet, but one thing was clear. Today, my family would see me. Not as Luke the overlooked, Luke the quiet, Luke the afterthought. Today, they'd see what happens when you underestimate someone for too long. And with that thought, I clicked transfer ownership on my laptop. By mid-afternoon, Ryan's promotion party was in full swing, and my sense of isolation had metastasized into something heavier, almost tangible. I drifted through the living room, quietly observing my family's orchestrated celebration. The room smelled of expensive takeout, champagne that Ryan's friends brought, and the subtle undertone of my own frustration simmering just beneath the surface. Mom had donned her usual supermom host persona, fussing over every detail while her phone pinged continuously with texts from relatives praising Ryan's success. Dad had taken it a step further, leaning over Ryan's shoulder, showing his colleagues pictures from Ryan's work projects as if this were some corporate showcase and I, Luke, didn't even exist. I tried to remind myself not to take it personally, though deep down, that voice was drowned out by the tide of neglect. I had been expecting this, maybe even preparing for it, but nothing could have softened the sting of watching your family treat your younger brother like the family's crown jewel while your own day, your own accomplishments, were left in the dust. And this wasn't just emotional neglect anymore. It felt intentional. Every laugh, every congratulatory handshake, every look at what my son has achieved statement was a carefully placed brick in a wall built to keep me invisible. Ryan, of course, was oblivious. He bounded around, charming the room with his usual mix of confidence and unearned entitlement. He laughed at jokes I didn't even hear, shook hands I wasn't offered, and basked in the warmth of attention I'd longed for since I was a teenager. I tried stepping forward a few times, offering polite congratulations, even attempting small talk. But the moment I opened my mouth, Mom would cut me off. "Luke, could you help me bring these drinks to the living room? Or don't bother. Honey, we've got it covered." Even Dad, when I tried to interject, would nod absent-mindedly and return to Ryan's glowing recounting of his big day at the firm. Each rejection was a tiny cut, a reminder that I was only allowed to exist on the periphery. I sank into the couch, crossed my arms, and stared at my laptop resting on the coffee table, the quiet promise of my private rebellion. My chest burned with resentment, but beneath it, there was a spark that had been building for years, the memory of every birthday overlooked, every school achievement ignored, every effort dismissed while Ryan collected accolades with effortless charm. And then came the straw that broke the back of my patience. Ryan, who had been posing for pictures with Mom and Dad, turned to me with that smug half-smile I had come to despise. "Hey, Luke, aren't you going to celebrate with me? You could at least smile for a photo." I felt heat rise to my ears, the first surge of real, unfiltered anger in the day. I swallowed, trying to control it, because this wasn't just about a photo. It was the culmination of years of favoritism, a lifetime of being made to feel like second place. I opened my mouth to reply, maybe to point out it was my birthday too, maybe to say something, anything, that would cut through the performance. But before I could, Dad chuckled. "Don't mind him, Ryan. Your day is what matters. Luke's birthday can wait. Maybe we'll have a small cake later." Later. The word was a dagger, cold and precise. Mom laughed, like my discomfort was a minor inconvenience rather than the culmination of years of emotional neglect. Ryan's friends cheered him on, oblivious to the subtle cruelty, treating me like I was some minor background character in their celebration. I retreated to my room, hands trembling as I tried to focus on my laptop. I wasn't sure if I was trembling from anger or from the realization that everything I'd quietly endured had led me to this boiling point. I had been pushed into a corner so many times I'd stopped counting. But today was different. Today, I was no longer content to let it slide. That night, after the party had wound down and Ryan was basking in the glow of his supposed triumph, I overheard the real shocker. My dad was on the phone, speaking in that smug, satisfied tone I'd heard far too many times before. "Yes, We're giving him the company shares as a reward for his hard work. Luke, he's too inexperienced. Ryan deserves this, absolutely. Too inexperienced. The words felt like molten lava pouring over my chest. My hands gripped the edge of the desk as I realized the extent of the betrayal. Not only had my birthday been ignored, not only had my parents' favoritism been blatant and merciless, but they had deliberately excluded me from a major family asset, a part of the very business my parents had built from scratch. Ryan, the golden boy, would inherit not just the accolades but the tangible rewards, while I was supposed to continue existing in their shadow. I couldn't breathe for a moment, the room spinning as the weight of it all hit me. Every birthday snub, every achievement minimized, every effort ignored. It wasn't random. It was intentional. And now, with their own words confirming it, I understood that my entire family had constructed this narrative. I was the background, Ryan was the star, and I was meant to accept it quietly, like I always had. I slammed the laptop shut, not in defeat, but in sudden clarity. I realized something essential. They hadn't actually thought about the consequences of underestimating me. They hadn't considered that years of neglect, years of emotional manipulation, and years of being treated like I didn't matter could harden into something far more potent than hurt feelings. For the first time, I felt a chilling sense of empowerment. I wasn't powerless. I had options, tools, leverage they hadn't even imagined. And for the first time, I realized the scale of what I could do. My hands hovered over the keyboard again, heart racing. This wasn't just anger. This was strategy forming. I replayed every slight, every dismissive comment, every forced smile, every moment I'd been pushed aside while Ryan took the spotlight. I realized that if I executed this carefully, if I planned my move with precision, I could make my family see me in a way they had never seen before. Not just as Luke, the overlooked one, but as someone they couldn't ignore. Sleep didn't come that night. I sat in my room, plotting quietly, letting the adrenaline sharpen my thoughts. Every image of Ryan laughing, every glance of approval from my parents, became fuel. I didn't want revenge in a petty sense. I wanted acknowledgement, power, a way to tilt the scales finally. And as the house grew quiet, I opened my laptop once more. My mind traced the steps I would need to execute, carefully, deliberately. The next morning, I woke to a family buzzing with afterglow. Ryan was showing off pictures from the party, Mom and Dad basking in the satisfaction of their perfect day. I walked into the kitchen, smiled faintly, and said, "Morning." No bitterness, no complaint, just calm, collected presence. That calm was the cloak under which I hid the storm building in me. My family had made one critical mistake. They believed my silence meant compliance. They believed that their favoritism and exclusion had defeated me. But under that calm exterior, every slight, every dismissal, every later had become a brick in the wall of my patience. And that wall had just been breached. It wasn't just a birthday anymore. It wasn't just another slight. It was the breaking point, the emotional climax of years of neglect, favoritism, and deliberate marginalization. And in that quiet morning, while Ryan was still basking in his parents' praise, I knew the day would come when the betrayal they had committed, this blatant, documented favoritism, would no longer go unanswered. For now, though, I held my tongue. I smiled faintly, carried my coffee to the living room, and sat down beside them. My family had no idea that I was no longer the overlooked one, that something had shifted inside me, that the very laptop I had toyed with the night before contained a move that would change everything. And as I sipped my coffee, pretending to enjoy the post-party chatter, a cold, thrilling sense of anticipation settled over me. This wasn't just about my birthday anymore. It was about setting the record straight and making sure that the people who had spent years dismissing me would finally understand exactly what happens when they underestimate someone for too long. And at that moment, I made a silent vow. When the time came, the betrayal they had planned for me would pale in comparison to the one I was about to execute. The days after my birthday felt like wandering through a haze, a mixture of numbness and simmering resentment. Ryan continued to float through life like a golden bubble, buoyed by the constant approval of Mom and Dad. while I walked through mine feeling like a ghost in my own home. Every interaction was a reminder. Their favoritism wasn't subtle anymore. It was blatant, almost theatrical. The final confirmation of that came when Dad called a family meeting under the guise of discussing future plans. I had a sinking feeling, but nothing could have prepared me for what he announced. "Luke," Dad began, leaning back in his chair with that smug, infuriating confidence. "We've been thinking. You're talented, yes, but you're not ready for major responsibilities yet. Ryan, on the other hand, has shown initiative, dedication, and leadership. We want to reward him with a larger stake in the business." I felt the words hitting me in waves, each one heavier than the last. My chest tightened, and a flash of disbelief crossed my mind. I tried to speak, tried to remind them that I had been contributing to the business quietly for years, that I'd built projects from the ground up and taken risks they hadn't even noticed, but the words caught in my throat. Dad shook his head before I could get a sentence out, cutting me off with the practiced authority of someone who had always decided the rules in advance. "I appreciate your work, Luke," Mom chimed in, her voice a polished mix of pity and dismissiveness. "But Ryan's timing, his focus, and his results have been exceptional. You'll understand when you have more experience." Experience. Right. They were calling me inexperienced while simultaneously blocking every opportunity I'd ever asked for. It was a damning contradiction, but worse, it was intentional. My parents had made it abundantly clear. In their eyes, I didn't measure up. Not for recognition, not for celebration, not for the family business, and certainly not for respect. I left the meeting quietly, walking back to my room with my mind spinning. I didn't cry, not yet, but the weight of everything pressed down like a storm cloud. I went to my desk and stared at my laptop, the device that had become my quiet anchor. I opened it and stared at the screen, almost blank, almost daring me to act. For the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge the thought that had been whispering in the back of my mind since the moment Dad said inexperienced. Maybe I didn't need their approval. Maybe I didn't need their validation. Over the next few days, I barely spoke to my family. Ryan continued to revel in his new ownership stake, parading it like a trophy, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing just a room away. Mom made passing attempts to involve me in celebratory conversations, but I kept my responses clipped, polite, and distant. I had reached rock bottom emotionally, but paradoxically, it was in that low state that clarity began to seep in. For years, I had been measuring myself against their standards, seeking acknowledgement I would never receive, and it had cost me peace of mind. One evening, after the house had grown quiet, I opened my laptop and began combing through all the projects, contracts, and digital assets I'd quietly built and managed over the years. It was tedious work, and I'd been putting it off for months, waiting for permission or recognition that never came. But now, without pressure from anyone else, I started organizing everything meticulously, creating folders, documenting contributions, and noting ownership and intellectual property rights where I could. It was almost therapeutic, a way to reclaim agency over something tangible, something I could control in a life where my family dictated every social and emotional parameter. As I worked, I began to realize just how much I had built quietly. Projects that Ryan had laughed off as small side things were actually generating revenue, attracting clients, and establishing a foundation I could leverage. I started tracking numbers, creating spreadsheets, and even drafting potential strategies for formal recognition or ownership transfer. I felt a thrill I hadn't experienced in years, not the empty rush of parental praise, but the deep, satisfying pulse of control and self-determination. Night after night, I poured myself into this. I researched legal protections, intellectual property rights, and digital asset management. I made connections discreetly with contacts I'd been cultivating, people who respected competence over family name, merit over entitlement. Slowly, a blueprint began to emerge, one that wouldn't just prove my worth to myself, but could eventually make my parents see that their neglect and favoritism had real, irreversible consequences. Meanwhile, at home, the atmosphere had shifted without me even speaking a word. Ryan and my parents were so focused on celebrating his victory that they didn't notice my withdrawal. They interpreted it as passive sulking, a minor inconvenience. They had no idea that in my silence, I was meticulously building the foundation for a game-changing move. Every slight, every dismissal, every later had been cataloged in my mind, now fueling the determination that had replaced my despair. One evening, Dad came into my room, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Luke, I hope you're coming to congratulate Ryan properly. We'd like to have a family dinner tomorrow to celebrate everything." I looked up at him, calm and measured, keeping my expression neutral. "Of course," I said softly, without enthusiasm, my tone betraying nothing. Inside, I felt the thrill of irony. They thought compliance meant weakness. They thought I was still the overlooked, second-rate child. They had no idea I was already planning my quiet, unstoppable rise. The next few weeks passed with a strange rhythm. Ryan and Dad were inseparable in their new business endeavors, Mom constantly hovering, keeping track of accolades, press mentions, and congratulatory emails. I kept my focus inward, quietly building my portfolio, securing documentation, and developing the operational knowledge that Ryan had been praised for but could never fully manage without my expertise. The thrill of control became addictive, the quiet power intoxicating. The tipping point came unexpectedly. I was reviewing client communications, checking contracts, and auditing ownership rights when I noticed an error, one that could have disastrous consequences for Ryan if leveraged correctly. A minor misstep in contract handling, overlooked in his rush to impress our parents, presented an opening. And suddenly, I realized just how fragile his supposed superiority was. For years, my family had treated me like I didn't matter, had dismissed my contributions, and now the same hubris that elevated Ryan could be turned against him. The thought made my pulse race. Not with spite, exactly, but with the sense of justice finally within reach. I imagined the look on Dad's face when he realized that his favoritism, his blind praise for Ryan, had left a blind spot that only I could exploit. I imagined Mom's carefully cultivated calm cracking as she realized her perfect son had been riding on a foundation I had quietly built. And Ryan, with all his smugness and entitlement, would have nowhere to hide. But it wasn't just about retribution. It was about self-worth. I had built something that belonged to me, something my family couldn't diminish or erase. And as I stared at the contracts, the spreadsheets, and the meticulously cataloged projects, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: pride. Real pride, rooted in competence, initiative, and control, rather than parental approval. Over the next month, I continued to refine my plan, ensuring that when the time came, it would be executed flawlessly. Every legal clause, every digital asset, every tiny oversight by my family was logged, cross-checked, and positioned to create maximum impact. I watched from the sidelines as Ryan continued to bask in undeserved praise, oblivious to the growing storm in his shadow. And in the quiet moments, late at night, when the house was still, I allowed myself to smile. The fall I had suffered after my birthday, the blatant favoritism, the betrayal, the crushing sense of invisibility, had been devastating. But it had also forged me. It had forced me to build something of real value, to reclaim agency, and to cultivate the patience and precision required to turn the tables. I wasn't just surviving the aftermath anymore. I was rising above it. I could feel it in my bones. The moment of reckoning was coming. My family had made a grave mistake in underestimating me, in dismissing my abilities, in thinking that neglect and favoritism could keep me in the shadows. The next chapter of this story wouldn't just be about recognition. It would be about proving, once and for all, that I was no longer the overlooked, invisible child. I was a force they had never anticipated. And as I closed my laptop that night, the same one that had once been my escape, I realized the truth. The fall had been necessary, the pain had been necessary, and now the rise, the true rise, was unstoppable. The reckoning was coming, and I would make sure it was unforgettable. The following weeks were a blur of calculated focus, quiet maneuvering, and relentless preparation. I had spent so many years existing in the shadows, watching my parents and Ryan treat me as if I were invisible, that the thrill of finally having control was intoxicating. But I knew I couldn't rush it. Revenge, or, more accurately, reclamation, required precision. It required patience. It required me to understand exactly what I had and exactly what they thought they had. And so, I began the work in earnest, not with anger driving me, but with a meticulous, deliberate mindset. The first step was inventory. I spent long hours at my laptop, compiling every project, every contract, every digital asset I had ever contributed to, refined and organized in a way that made the scope of my work undeniable. Every spreadsheet, every email chain, every tiny overlooked detail was documented, timestamped, and cross-referenced. It was astonishing, in a way, to realize how much I had actually accomplished, quietly, while my parents and Ryan had been so focused on performance that could be flaunted publicly. The numbers, the proof, the evidence, it was all mine, and for the first time, it felt like an arsenal rather than just work. I began identifying weaknesses. Ryan was meticulous in public, but sloppy in execution. He loved appearances more than substance. Mom and Dad were blind to operational details, easily impressed by surface-level metrics and flashy presentations. I could see exactly how they valued things: recognition, status, and the illusion of competence. And I realized that if I played my cards right, I could use their assumptions against them, turning their neglect into my leverage. But I wasn't just compiling evidence. I was creating opportunities. I reached out quietly to some old contacts I had cultivated over the years, people who respected skill over family name, merit over entitlement. I framed my conversations carefully, casual and unassuming, planting seeds of collaboration and partnership without revealing the full scope of my intentions. I wasn't building allies in the conventional sense. I was constructing a network of support, a quiet safety net that Ryan and my parents had never imagined I could establish. At home, I played the part of the compliant, distant child perfectly. Ryan was busy reveling in the supposed triumph of his promotion. Mom hovered around him constantly, and Dad spent hours reviewing business reports with Ryan as if I weren't in the room. I attended dinners, nodded politely during discussions, and never let slip the magnitude of what I was building. Every smile I offered was neutral, measured, carefully masking the storm of preparation behind my eyes. And then I began the strategic setup. I started by introducing small suggestions during casual family conversations, knowing they would underestimate me and overlook their potential impact. I noticed the software system is missing some audit logs. I mentioned casually one evening. Mom nodded absently. "Oh, thanks, Luke. We'll look into it." No one else followed up. I had predicted that, but I quietly corrected the errors, ensuring that when the right moment came, the system would be fully documented and under my control. I also began discreetly consolidating access points. Digital ownership, accounts, admin rights, passwords, everything that Ryan's promotion had inadvertently ignored or assumed he controlled, slowly came under my purview. Each time I did this, I felt a thrill, not of malice, but of reclaiming agency. It was my work, my intelligence, my foresight, and they had assumed it was nothing, invisible, beneath them. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. I would catch Ryan laughing with Mom, showing off a new client meeting he had conducted, and I'd feel the old familiar sting of resentment. But instead of letting it overwhelm me, I allowed it to fuel the precision of my strategy. I cataloged everything mentally: his patterns, his arrogance, the predictable ways my parents responded to him. I noted every instance where their attention could be manipulated, every instance where I could quietly step in and redirect outcomes. One of the most important parts of my setup was timing. I knew I needed the perfect moment, one where their hubris was at its peak, their vigilance at its lowest, and their assumptions about me utterly complete. That meant patience. I bided my time, waiting for events to unfold naturally. I didn't rush interactions, didn't force mistakes. I let Ryan overextend himself, let my parents get distracted by appearances and praise, and let the house lull into the rhythm of routine negligence. The longer I waited, the more predictable they became, and the more leverage I quietly amassed. I also rehearsed. Every conversation, every interaction, every email or message I would eventually send, I played through in my mind. How would Dad react if I suddenly asserted my ownership? How would Mom respond if I revealed the full scope of my contributions? How would Ryan, so used to immediate validation and unearned confidence, react when the foundation of his supposed success was suddenly exposed as fragile and dependent on me? I imagined their confusion, their frustration, their disbelief, and I let it strengthen my resolve. At the same time, I worked on building my own confidence. For years, my self-worth had been tied to their approval, their constant comparisons, and their favoritism toward Ryan. But now, the work I was doing was for me, not for them. Every completed spreadsheet, every corrected oversight, every quietly consolidated asset became a tangible marker of my competence. I was no longer operating in their shadow. I was creating my own sphere of control, invisible to them, but growing stronger every day. And I began experimenting with subtle manipulations. Small things at first, redirecting emails, fixing overlooked discrepancies in contracts, quietly adjusting project ownership in ways that would only be noticeable when I was ready to reveal them. Every minor adjustment was a test, a way to measure their assumptions and reactions without tipping my hand. I watched Ryan stumble over small mistakes, unaware that I was silently correcting, cataloging, and strengthening my position all at once. Every error he made, every oversight, was a brick I could later use in constructing the eventual revelation. By the time a month had passed since my birthday, the house had returned to its usual rhythm. Ryan basking in praise, Mom and Dad hovering around him, and I quietly observing, meticulously documenting, and expanding my influence in ways they would never notice until the right moment. The contrast between their complacency and my calculated preparation gave me a sense of exhilaration I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't angry in the chaotic, emotional way I had been on my birthday. I was calm, deliberate, and immensely patient. I was no longer reacting to neglect. I was engineering a precise, inevitable outcome. One evening, as I watched Ryan boasting to Mom about a new client deal he had secured, without realizing how reliant it was on my groundwork, I felt a quiet satisfaction. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about reclaiming what was mine, about proving to myself that I didn't need their recognition to validate my abilities. They had tried to ignore me, to push me aside, to elevate Ryan at my expense. But in doing so, they had underestimated the very thing that had always been my strength: focus, patience, and attention to detail. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my laptop, the central hub of my quiet empire. Every file, every spreadsheet, every project was under my control. Every overlooked detail, every minor oversight by Ryan or my parents, had been cataloged and corrected, or held in reserve for the moment it could have maximum impact. And as I sipped my coffee, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The setup was complete, or as close as it could be without tipping my hand. The stage was set, the pieces were in place, and the next moves would not be reactive. They would be entirely deliberate. I had reached the point where I could step back, observe, and wait for the perfect opening. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't acting out of impulse. I was preparing to execute a plan that would change everything, silently, irrevocably, and with the kind of precision that would leave my family scrambling to understand how they had been outmaneuvered. And for the first time in years, I felt truly, profoundly in control, not just of my own fate, but of the story that had always been written without my consent. The house was quiet that night, the soft hum of appliances the only sound in the background. Ryan was upstairs, likely gloating over imagined triumphs, and Mom and Dad had retired to their room, chatting about future plans for the business. I sat at my desk, reviewing the last set of contracts one more time, double-checking access rights and ownership documentation. Everything was aligned, everything accounted for, and everything positioned for the perfect opportunity. And as I shut my laptop, a wave of anticipation rolled over me. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought I was still the overlooked, invisible child. But I had quietly shifted the balance. The setup was complete, the moment was approaching, and when it came, the consequences would be undeniable. For now, I waited patiently, watching, calculating, and letting the anticipation grow. I wasn't just preparing revenge. I was preparing a reckoning, and I knew, deep down, that it would be spectacular. The day finally arrived, and the calm precision I had cultivated over weeks of planning came into sharp focus. I didn't rush. I didn't act recklessly. I knew my family well enough to predict their reactions, their blind spots, and their predictable arrogance. And I had the perfect weapon: control of every digital asset, every operational detail, every contract and project that Ryan had assumed he managed on his own. In the hands of anyone else, it would have looked like incompetence, but in mine, it was a lever of power that I had been quietly building for years. I started with the accidental email, a message crafted to look casual and informative, sent to all relevant clients and internal teams. It highlighted minor, but critical, errors in recent transactions attributed to Ryan's oversight. Nothing catastrophic yet, just enough to raise eyebrows, stir questions, and redirect attention. The beauty of it was in its subtlety. No one would suspect me, the compliant, quiet sibling who had faded into the background for so long. By mid-morning, Dad called Ryan into his office, his face tight with confusion. "Ryan, can you explain this? The Henderson deal shows discrepancies we don't understand." Ryan, confident and cocky as ever, stammered. I thought I handled it, Dad. I reviewed everything myself." "Clearly not," Dad interrupted, his tone sharp for the first time since he'd been lavishing praise on Ryan. I stayed in the background, watching, smiling faintly to myself. The cracks had begun to appear. I escalated quietly. I initiated internal audits, using my administrative control to highlight Ryan's errors systematically. Every minor mistake, every skipped step, every overlooked contract clause was documented and flagged. And because I had the foresight to correct some issues preemptively, it appeared as though I was the only one competent enough to maintain stability while the house of cards Ryan had been resting on began to wobble. By late afternoon, the situation had escalated enough that Mom and Dad were calling emergency meetings, frantically trying to cover the gaps Ryan had created. Ryan, once the golden boy, was now floundering, his confident smiles replaced by panicked explanations and defensive gestures. I remained calm, neutral, occasionally offering helpful suggestions that guided them back to solutions only I could implement. Every time they followed my guidance, they were unknowingly ceding control, validating the very skill and authority they had long dismissed in me. The next step was the formal revelation. I called a family meeting, claiming that I wanted to review some operational updates for clarity. Dad, still in reactive mode, agreed immediately, eager to get control back and unaware that the meeting was about to shift the balance permanently. I projected the documents, spreadsheets, and client communications I had organized over weeks, carefully outlining the errors Ryan had made and showing, with precise timestamps and evidence, how I had been quietly correcting and managing critical operations all along. The room went silent. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide. Dad's face drained of color as he scrolled through the documentation. And Ryan, who had lived in the glow of unearned praise, stood frozen, his usual arrogance evaporating in the face of indisputable proof. "I don't understand," Ryan stammered, finally finding his voice. "I thought I was managing all of this." "You were managing appearances," I said softly, calm and deliberate, letting the weight of my tone sink in. "I was managing reality. Every contract, every project, every client interaction. I have been handling these responsibilities quietly while everyone else assumed you were in control. And now, it's clear who has been keeping this business afloat." Mom tried to intervene, her voice trembling. "Luke, you shouldn't. I think you should listen," I interrupted, my voice even but commanding. "This isn't about favoritism anymore. It's about facts. The work has been done, the responsibility assumed, and the record is clear." Dad's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment and anger, as he realized the magnitude of what I had revealed. Every time he had claimed Ryan earned it, every time he had dismissed my contributions, he had been complicit in elevating someone less capable over someone competent. And now, the consequences of that negligence were undeniable. I handed Dad a folder containing all the legal documents I had prepared, ownership and intellectual property fully documented, everything aligned to demonstrate my rightful control over key aspects of the family business. Transfer of ownership is complete, I said quietly, almost conversationally, clicking through the files on my laptop. Everything under my name now. You and Ryan can see the documentation. This is final. The reactions were instantaneous and chaotic. Ryan's face paled, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for an explanation that didn't exist. You can't. This isn't. It is, I interrupted. Legally, ethically, and operationally. Everything is documented. I've taken every precaution, anticipated every loophole, and ensured it's all above board. There's nothing you can do to reverse it without admitting the years of neglect, mismanagement, and favoritism you've displayed. Mom's eyes filled with tears, not of pride, but of shock and frustration, as if the world she had so carefully curated around Ryan had just collapsed. Dad stood silently, stunned, realizing that his entire narrative of favoritism and validation had been turned into a spectacle that exposed his judgment as flawed and biased. Ryan finally lost it. He shouted, his voice cracking with anger and disbelief. This isn't fair. I did everything right. I earned this. You earned the illusion, I said softly, letting the words sink in. I built the reality. And now, the reality is mine to manage. The room was silent after that, a heavy, suffocating quiet that underscored the complete reversal of power. My family had spent years believing they controlled the narrative, the assets, and the recognition, but now every assumption had been dismantled calmly, methodically, and completely. There was no shouting, no chaos, no impulsive mistakes on my part. Just precision, just undeniable truth. As I looked around the room at their stunned faces, I felt a wave of satisfaction that wasn't rooted in cruelty, but in justice. The people who had dismissed me, overlooked me, and elevated someone less capable had finally been forced to acknowledge the consequences of their actions. And in that acknowledgement, I found a sense of closure that I had been denied for so long. I stood, closed my laptop, and said, almost softly, I hope now you understand. Underestimating someone has consequences. Ignoring someone has consequences. Favoritism and negligence don't just disappear. They come back around, in ways you least expect. Ryan's shoulders slumped. Dad's jaw tightened. Mom's eyes brimmed with tears, and for the first time, I realized they had no words to counter the truth I had presented. It wasn't vindictive, it was just reality, and the consequences were theirs to bear. And as I walked out of the room, leaving them to absorb the full scope of what had just occurred, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't second place. I hadn't just taken control of the business. I had reclaimed my identity, my power, and my self-worth in a way that nothing else could undo. I glanced back once, seeing their faces, shocked, frustrated, humbled, and allowed myself a small, private smile. For the first time in my life, I had rewritten the story they had written for me. And I knew, without a doubt, that this moment, this exact moment, was mine, fully and irrevocably. The family that had spent years overlooking me, dismissing me, and elevating Ryan above me had finally learned what happens when the underestimated quietly rise. And as I closed the door behind me, leaving the room and their astonished faces behind, I felt a clarity and peace I had never known before. I was no longer invisible. I was no longer overlooked. I was, finally, undeniable.